They didn't whisper it. They didn't publish it in obscure journals or pass it along in a hushed conversation between academics. They published it. They wrote it into the permanent record, into books, into articles, into the very references the world was trained to trust. The source of this devastating judgment was Oxford itself. The institution many call the guardian of the English language, the ultimate arbiter of linguistic truth, once made a stunning declaration. It dismissed the language of an entire nation, the Filipino tongue, as a broken tongue. Imagine the weight of that statement. An entire people's identity, their mode of expression, their inherited culture, was reduced to a public insult. It was printed and spread as if it were an undisputed scientific fact. This began deep in the colonial era, a legacy of scholars who, blinded by their own deeply ingrained sense of superiority, simply could not see beyond the narrow definitions of language purity they had established for themselves. They observed the way Filipinos spoke. It was a fluid, complex, and beautiful tapestry, a spontaneous blending of indigenous native words with the historical influences of English, Spanish, and other regional dialects. It was a vibrant, evolving organism. And yet, instead of calling it rich, they labeled it improper. Instead of recognizing it as evolving, they contemptuously declared it damaged. The very word Filipino became in their eyes a contradiction. A nation fiercely proud of its culture, its history, its independence was simultaneously mocked and undermined for the very language its people used to express that pride. And then, the ultimate authority sealed the insult. The Oxford Dictionary, seen globally as the highest court of linguistic appeal, classified Filipino English as something inherently less than standard. It was marginal. It was an aberration. For decades, this judgment became a deep, invisible scar carried by millions. Students grew up in classrooms being told, implicitly and explicitly, that their natural, inherited way of speaking wasn't quite good enough. They were encouraged to strip the rhythm, the musicality, the very Filipino-ness out of their voices in a futile pursuit of a foreign, perfect accent. Filipino workers who traveled abroad, seeking to build better lives for their families, found themselves laughed at for their accents in hallways, on job sites, and even in grocery stores. These small, constant, abrasive moments piled up. Even inside the Philippines, a quiet self-doubt took root. Many began to truly believe the lie that their English, their Filipino, even their spontaneous, efficient Taglish was inherently inferior. It was a crisis of confidence fueled by a single, powerful, and utterly incorrect word, broken. But history, in its long, powerful arc, has a way of turning the most powerful insults into weapons of resilience. What the Oxford scholars failed entirely to understand was this fundamental truth. The Filipino language was never broken. It was, and always had been, gloriously alive. It was adaptive, it was tenacious, and it was about to prove itself in ways the global elite could not possibly ignore. The stage for this vindication was not being set in a grand hall or a university quadrangle. It was being set in the most humble of places, the common workplaces of the world, where the Filipino voice had started to travel. It journeyed through the airwaves, through books, through the millions of hard-working citizens who carried their accents, their patience, and their linguistic dexterity to every corner of the globe. Every laugh, every sneer, every mocking remark was not a deterrent, it was fuel. It was energy channeled into a quiet, unstoppable resolve. What the world didn't see coming was how this so-called broken language was not retreating in shame, but quietly, brilliantly building its power. The first, most potent stage of the rebuttal began in the high-rise offices across Manila and Cebu. In the vast, humming call centers of the Philippines, young Filipinos were learning to speak to the world one customer service interaction at a time. Customers from America, Britain, Australia, and all over Europe picked up their phones, frustrated and indifferent, expecting a robotically delivered script. Instead, they were greeted by a voice that was clear, articulate, and carried a warmth and dedication they rarely encountered elsewhere. The initial mockery was still there. Where are you calling from? Why do you sound different? People would ask, often dismissively. But then the same voices, the same broken accents began to perform a kind of everyday, linguistic alchemy. They solved complex problems. They calmed escalating frustrations. They untangled impossible billing errors. They built immediate, genuine human trust across continents. Oxford's definition hadn't changed, but reality was already rewriting the story in millions of successful transactions. In global corporations, Filipino workers began to be praised not just for their English proficiency, but for their incredible patience, empathy, and remarkable adaptability. The world's largest, most powerful companies began quietly, completely relying on the voices and skills they had once dismissed as inferior. Meanwhile, a second front was opening in the academic world.
In classrooms and on debate stages, Filipino students were proving themselves unbeatable. At prestigious institutions like Harvard, Cambridge, and major universities in Tokyo and Berlin, judges sat stunned. A speaker from Manila or Cebu or Davao would stand at the podium, not trying to hide their natural accent, and deliver arguments so sharp, so clear, so meticulously structured that the accent, the brokenness no longer mattered in the slightest. What mattered, and what ultimately won, was the mind behind the words. Slowly, the derogatory label of Taglish, the fluid, spontaneous switching between Tagalog and English, was no longer mocked as confusion. It was celebrated as agility. The Filipino tongue possessed the unique ability to bend, to adapt, to survive, and to be instantly efficient in ways the rigid, monolingual gatekeepers of Oxford could never have imagined. The very thing they called broken was, in fact, undeniable proof of a cognitive and linguistic strength possessed by few other nations on earth. And yet, the world still required one final, undeniable moment. A stage. A voice. An event so powerful that the generations-old insult could never again be spoken with authority. That moment was closer than anyone realized. Because soon, the Filipino voice wasn't just going to answer phone calls or win debates in distant universities. It was going to step into the white-hot spotlight of history and stand face-to-face with Oxford itself. The stage was set, a major international linguistic conference, hosted by Oxford within the hallowed, ancient walls of one of its most prestigious colleges. Scholars from around the world filled the grand, oak-paneled hall. British professors of philology, American computational linguists, Japanese sociolinguists, and German experts on dialectal shifts, all waited to hear what they assumed would be a minor, deferential voice from a small, peripheral country. When the Filipino protagonist, a young but already renowned linguist, stepped to the podium, a few delegates smirked. A few older professors whispered to each other, the echoes of broken still lingering, phantom-like, in the air. But the Filipino did not bow his head this time. He lifted his gaze, his bearing crisp, focused, and powerful under the bright lights of the hall.
He began to speak. At first, he spoke in impeccable, fluid English, a tone that carried immediate, undeniable authority. He told the story of how language should be viewed, not as rigid chains that limit thought, but as powerful, unstoppable rivers. Rivers bend, they merge with other streams, they adapt to the terrain they traverse, and this adaptation does not make them weaker. It makes them more resilient, more capable of supporting life. The audience listened, politely, waiting for the predictable moment where his accent would falter or his grammar would slip. But then he shifted. Without a moment of hesitation, without breaking the rhythm of his argument, he slipped into Filipino. The entire cadence of the hall changed. The air filled with a sound that was musical, resonant, and utterly commanding. Then, in a seamless demonstration of his historical consciousness, he integrated phrases of Spanish. And then back to a sharp, concise English. Finally, he demonstrated Taglish fluid, natural, and utterly unstoppable, using the code switching not as a linguistic crutch, but as a deliberate rhetorical device that emphasized a complex idea with maximum efficiency. Every word, every shift, every linguistic layer was stitched together into a single, compelling story of national survival, intellectual resilience, and communicative brilliance. The scholars who had once mocked, the delegates who had come to judge, now leaned forward, scribbling notes furiously, their faces a mixture of surprise and dawning recognition. Oxford, the great guardian of language, was witnessing a truth it could no longer deny. The Filipino tongue was not broken. It was the living, breathing proof of linguistic evolution itself. He ended with words that silenced the vast room, the microphone amplifying the power of his final declaration: languages are not broken. They are simply alive. And if survival, if adaptability, and if the capacity for cultural unity are the true measures of a language's strength, then the Filipino language in all its varied, brilliant forms is one of the strongest in the entire world. The hall erupted, not in mockery, not in whispers, but in applause. It was a thunderous, echoing ovation that shook the very foundation of the ancient walls of Oxford. Delegates rose to their feet. Scholars who had spent their lives studying linguistic hierarchy wiped tears from their eyes. For the first time in centuries, Oxford wasn't the one defining Filipino. Filipino was defining itself. And from that monumental day forward, the invisible scar left by the word broken